Hello everyone. Welcome to Nightmare Chronicles. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more chilling tales. Now get comfortable and relax for the best experience. Grab your headset. It was supposed to be a harmless Halloween prank, just a dare to spice up the night. My friends, Trevor and Emily, had always loved pushing the limits on Halloween, but this year, they wanted to do something bigger, something darker. So when Trevor dared me to sneak into Old Man Harper's cornfield and steal one of his scarecrows, I hesitated. The old man was known for being strange. Some even said he was crazy. His property was secluded, just outside of town, and the rumors surrounding his cornfield were enough to make anyone think twice. But it was Halloween, and I wasn't about to back down from a challenge. "Come on, Jake," Emily teased. "It's just a scarecrow. What's the worst that could happen?" I shrugged off the uneasy feeling in my gut. "Fine," I said, trying to sound brave, "but you two are coming with me." We grabbed our flashlights and set off into the cool October night, making our way to Harper's property. The cornfield loomed ahead, the tall stalks swaying gently in the breeze, but there was something eerie about the place. The closer we got, the more I regretted agreeing to this. The entrance to the cornfield was marked by a dilapidated wooden fence, barely standing. Beyond it, the rows of corn stretched endlessly, their tops rustling in the wind. At the center of the field stood the scarecrows, their ragged forms visible even from a distance. "They're just old stuffed dummies," I told myself, trying to shake off the growing unease. Trevor hopped over the fence first, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Emily followed, and I reluctantly brought up the rear. The cornfield was silent, save for the occasional gust of wind. The air felt heavy, like something was watching us. "There!" Trevor pointed ahead, his beam of light landing on one of the scarecrows. It was perched on a wooden cross, its burlap sack face twisted into a grotesque expression. Straw poked out from its sleeves, and its body sagged under the weight of years spent guarding the field. "Go on, Jake. It's your dare," Emily said, nudging me forward. I swallowed hard and approached the scarecrow. Up close, it was even creepier than I'd expected. Its button eyes were black and lifeless, and its wide, stitched grin seemed to mock me. I reached out to grab it, but as soon as my fingers touched the straw-filled body, the air around me seemed to grow colder. A shiver ran down my spine, and I hesitated. "Hurry up, man," Trevor called, his voice distant, like it was being swallowed by the darkness. I yanked the scarecrow down from its post, the wooden cross creaking as I did. For a second, I thought I heard a low whisper carried on the wind, but when I turned, no one was there. With the scarecrow slung over my shoulder, we started making our way back to the fence, but that's when things started to go wrong. As we walked through the cornfield, the rows of stalks began to feel suffocating, as if they were closing in on us. I noticed Emily looking around nervously, her flashlight flickering. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hear what?" Trevor asked, glancing over his shoulder. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the wind moving through the corn. Still, there was an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach, like we weren't alone. "We should get out of here," I muttered, quickening my pace. That's when we heard it. A soft, rustling sound, too close to be just the wind. I spun around, shining my flashlight back toward the center of the field. The scarecrows stood still, just as they had before, but something felt off. One of them, a few rows back, seemed closer than before. I could have sworn it had been farther away. "Let's move," I urged, my voice tight with fear. We hurried toward the fence, but no matter how fast we walked, the sound of rustling followed us. I dared to look back again, and this time I saw it. One of the scarecrows was moving. Its limbs twitched unnaturally, and it seemed to be stumbling through the corn, coming straight for us. "Run!" I screamed. We bolted, sprinting through the narrow paths between the corn stalks. The scarecrow's movements grew faster, more deliberate, as it pursued us. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear Emily and Trevor panting beside me. The flashlight beams bounced wildly as we ran, casting fleeting shadows that made everything more disorienting. "What the hell is happening?" Trevor shouted, his voice frantic. "I don't know. Just keep running." I shouted back, the scarecrow's twisted grin burning in my mind. The rustling grew louder, the corn stalks parting as the scarecrow drew closer. I glanced back and nearly stumbled when I saw it. A grotesque figure made of straw and tattered fabric, its face contorted with malice. It moved with unnatural speed, its limbs jerking like a puppet on strings. We reached the fence, and I threw the scarecrow I'd been carrying to the ground, desperate to escape. Trevor was the first to leap over, followed by Emily. But just as I swung my legs over, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down in horror. The scarecrow's hand had latched onto me, its straw fingers digging into my skin. I kicked wildly, my heart hammering in my chest, and with a final desperate pull, I broke free and fell onto the other side of the fence. We didn't stop running until we were halfway back to town. My ankle throbbed, and my mind raced with confusion and terror. What had just happened? How could a scarecrow move like that? None of it made sense. When we finally stopped, gasping for air, Trevor looked at me, wide-eyed. That thing, what was that? I don't know, I admitted, my voice shaking. But it wasn't a prank. Something's wrong with that field. Emily was pale, clutching her flashlight tightly. We need to tell someone, the police, or anyone. But who would believe us? We'd broken into a cornfield on a dare, and now we had a story about a living scarecrow? It sounded insane. As we made our way back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Every gust of wind through the trees, every shadow in the corner of my vision, it all felt wrong. And that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the rustling sound, the creaking of the scarecrow's joints as it moved. A few days later, we heard the news. Old Man Harper had been found dead in his cornfield, his body twisted in an unnatural pose, with straw stuffed into his mouth. No one could explain how he died, but I knew. The scarecrows had finally had their revenge.
I've always loved Halloween. The thrill of the crisp October air, the dark streets lit by jack-o'-lanterns, and the joy of pulling off the perfect prank. Every year, my friends and I would compete to see who could orchestrate the best scare. This year was going to be different, though. I had something big planned. It started as a joke. My friend Mark dared me to stage a haunted house in the abandoned mansion at the edge of town. The place was infamous for being creepy, even in broad daylight. People said it was cursed, haunted by the spirit of a young girl who had vanished there years ago. Perfect, I thought. If I could scare my friends there, it would go down as the greatest prank in our group's history. I gathered supplies, fake blood, costumes, sound effects. I even convinced Mark to help me set up. We spent the day before Halloween arranging everything. Hidden speakers for eerie sounds, hanging ghosts, and a few motion sensors to trigger sudden movements. By the time we finished, the place looked terrifying. We were proud of it. Little did we know, something else had plans for us. Halloween night came, and I sent out an invite to our group, urging them to come explore the haunted house after dark. I knew they wouldn't be able to resist. The group included 5 of us: Mark, Sarah, Jess, Brian, and me. We met at the edge of the woods near the mansion, flashlights in hand, the moon full above us. The house loomed ahead, its broken windows like empty eye sockets, its once grand structure now a crumbling ruin. I could feel the excitement building as we approached. This was going to be epic. "I swear if you jump out at me, I'm punching you," Sarah joked nervously. "Relax," I said, grinning, though a small part of me felt uneasy. As much as I loved the thrill of Halloween, something about that house never sat right with me. But I shook it off. It was just an old building. We stepped inside, the door creaking ominously. The air was stale, the darkness almost suffocating. The prank was ready to begin. At first, everything went according to plan. Jess was the first to react when one of the motion sensors triggered a hanging ghost to drop from the ceiling. Her scream echoed through the halls, and we all laughed. "You're such a jerk," she shouted, trying to calm herself. "This place gives me the creeps." "Isn't that the point?" Mark winked. We continued deeper into the mansion, the atmosphere growing thicker, more oppressive. I activated another speaker, and the sound of distant whispers filled the air, sending shivers down everyone's spine. I was loving it, until something happened that I hadn't planned. A loud crash echoed from upstairs. We all froze. That wasn't us, I whispered to Mark, who looked equally confused. Maybe it's the wind, Sarah said, but her voice wavered. No way, Jess argued. That sounded like footsteps. We stood in silence, the laughter dying, replaced by an icy tension. I tried to remember if there was anything up there that could have made that noise. But no, the upper floor had been completely empty when we set up the prank. I'll check it out, I said, trying to sound brave, though every instinct screamed at me to stay put. I crept up the stairs, the wood groaning beneath my feet. Mark followed, flashlight sweeping over the walls. The others stayed behind, watching with wide eyes. When we reached the top, everything seemed normal. Just an empty hallway with dust and cobwebs. I started to relax, convinced it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us. That's when I saw her. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing at the far end of the hall. At first, I thought it was one of the mannequins we had placed as part of the prank, but then it moved. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure slowly turned toward us. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those eyes were hollow black pits. She smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that sent a wave through me. What the hell? Mark whispered, his voice trembling. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows around the room. The figure took a step forward. That was enough to break me out of my trance. Run! I screamed, grabbing Mark by the arm and bolting down the stairs. Behind me, I could hear the others yelling, asking what was going on, but I couldn't stop to explain. We burst out the front door, gasping for air. I looked back at the house, expecting to see her in the doorway. But the figure was gone. What happened? Sarah asked, panic in her voice. There was someone up there, I managed to say, trying to catch my breath. A woman. She wasn't part of the prank. Mark nodded, his face pale. I saw her too. Jess, always the skeptic, frowned. You're messing with us, right? You're just trying to take the prank too far. I shook my head. No, this wasn't part of the plan, I swear. We stood in silence, staring at the house. The wind howled through the broken windows, but there was no sign of the figure. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a trick of the light, our imaginations? Or was the legend of the haunted house real after all? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, pale, smiling, and waiting. I've pulled a lot of pranks in my life, but none of them ever felt like this. Something about that house was wrong. I never went back. And to this day, none of my friends talk about what we saw. But every Halloween, I think about that night, and I wonder if she's still there, waiting for someone else to come looking for a scare.
Every year, our town hosted a haunted hayride that drew people from miles around. It had become a tradition, part of what made our small town feel special during Halloween. Families would come together, pile onto the hay bales in the back of a tractor, and be driven through the dark woods while actors dressed as ghosts, witches, and monsters jumped out to scare them. But this year, something was different. I had been working the hayride for 3 years, and it was always a good laugh. I knew every scare, every hiding spot, and every actor's role. The only challenge was making the scares feel fresh for people who came back year after year. So when the owner, Mr. Thompson, told us he was adding something new, an extra scare in the deep part of the woods, I didn't think much of it. He said it would be a surprise, even to us employees. That night, as the final hayride of Halloween rolled around, I was stationed at my usual spot in the forest, dressed as a headless horseman. I waited for the tractor to roll by, listening to the distant screams of people getting scared further up the trail. But there was something odd in the air, an unsettling stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As the tractor came into view, I saw the usual wide-eyed families, some laughing nervously, others clutching their kids tight. I leaped out from behind a tree, holding my fake severed head, and the kids screamed on cue. It was all in good fun, and I got the reaction I was expecting. But as the tractor moved further down the trail, I noticed something strange. There was an extra figure at the back of the hayride, someone dressed in an old, tattered black cloak. At first, I thought it was one of the actors Mr. Thompson had hired for the new scare, but none of us had been told to wear anything like that. The figure didn't move. It just stood at the edge of the woods, watching the tractor pass by. A chill ran through me, and I found myself stepping back, suddenly anxious. Something about that figure wasn't right. It looked too still, too real. I radioed Mr. Thompson. "Hey, who's the guy in the black cloak near the back of the hayride?" I asked. There was a long pause on the other end. "What guy?" "We didn't hire anyone new for tonight," he replied, sounding confused. My stomach dropped. The rest of the night went on without incident. At least, that's what I thought. I finished my shift, and we all gathered back at the barn to wrap things up. I asked some of the other actors if they had seen the figure in the cloak, but no one had. It was as if I had imagined it. Then, just as we were about to leave, one of the families from the hayride approached Mr. Thompson. The father was pale, his hands shaking as he spoke. "There was someone else on the hayride," he stammered. "Someone we didn't see get on with us." Mr. Thompson looked concerned but tried to calm the man down. "I'm sure it was just one of the actors. No need to worry." But the father shook his head. No, this was different. They didn't scare anyone. They didn't move. They just disappeared halfway through the ride. A silence fell over the group. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The father was describing the same figure I had seen in the woods. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figure, about the way it had stood so still, almost blending into the shadows. There was something deeply wrong about it, something unnatural. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I asked around town, speaking to some of the older residents, and eventually, I stumbled across an old local legend I had never heard before. Years ago, before the hayride became a tradition, the woods surrounding our town were rumored to be haunted. According to the legend, a man had once lived deep in the forest, shunned by the town for reasons that were never clear. Some said he practiced dark magic, others claimed he was just strange, but everyone agreed on one thing: he disappeared under mysterious circumstances. People said that his spirit wandered the woods, unable to rest. Every few years around Halloween, sightings of a cloaked figure would be reported, always near the same spot in the woods where the hayride now passed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure I had seen was the same one from the legend. I told Mr. Thompson about the legend, but he laughed it off, calling it nothing more than a campfire story. Still, he seemed on edge. I could tell the father's account from the previous night had rattled him. Halloween came to an end, and the hayride was set to close for the season. But Mr. Thompson decided to run one last ride as a private event for some of the town's council members. He asked me to come along, saying he needed a few extra hands to make sure everything went smoothly. I agreed, though the thought of going back into those woods unsettled me. The night was colder than usual, and the woods seemed darker, as if the shadows were thicker somehow. The ride started out normal enough. Families laughing, kids screaming, everyone enjoying the scares. But as we neared the deep part of the woods, I felt that same eerie stillness in the air. My heart raced as I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of the cloaked figure. Then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the path, just like before, was the same black cloaked figure, watching the hayride. I froze, unable to move or even speak. This time, I knew it wasn't one of the actors. This time, I knew it wasn't a prank. The figure began to move, slowly, gliding toward the hayride. The people on the tractor didn't seem to notice, but I could feel a palpable shift in the air, a coldness, like the very life was being drained from the woods. Then, Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but an empty trail behind. The ride ended without incident, and no one mentioned seeing anything strange. But I knew what I had seen, and I wasn't the only one. The next morning, Mr. Thompson called me in a panic. "One of the council members never made it home last night," he said, his voice shaking. "We've searched everywhere, but he's gone." I didn't know what to say. I had seen that figure, felt its presence, and now someone had disappeared, just like the legend warned. The haunted hayride was shut down after that. No one in town wanted to risk it anymore. But I couldn't forget what I had seen, and I knew that whatever haunted those woods was still out there, waiting for the next Halloween to come. Halloween night had always been our thing. Every year, my friends and I pulled pranks on each other. Nothing too serious, just enough to scare the living daylights out of one another. But this year, things got out of hand. It was Kyle's idea to visit the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. "The place is practically begging for a good scare," he said. I was hesitant, though. Unlike the others, I'd always had a strange feeling about that cemetery. It wasn't just the fact that it was abandoned, it was the eerie silence that hung over it, like the dead were still watching. Still, I didn't want to be the only one who chickened out. So I agreed, and soon enough, the plan was set. We would meet at the cemetery just before midnight and prank the others by hiding behind the graves. Kyle even had fake blood and chains to add to the scare factor. Little did we know, what started as a prank would turn into something far worse. The cemetery was even more unsettling at night. The tombstones, some of which were over 100 years old, were cracked and weathered, their inscriptions barely legible. A thick fog rolled in from the woods, wrapping itself around the graves like ghostly fingers. The only sound was the distant hooting of an owl. We met at the entrance, me, Kyle, Jenna, and Sarah. Kyle, as usual, was carrying a duffel bag filled with props for the prank. "All right," he said, grinning mischievously. "Let's split up. We'll each hide behind different tombstones and wait for the others to arrive." I reluctantly took my place behind a tall, moss-covered headstone, its surface cold and damp against my back. As I crouched down, the fog thickened, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in front of me. The minutes ticked by, and soon the air was filled with the sounds of our poorly stifled giggles and whispers. But as midnight approached, something changed. The temperature dropped sharply, and an unnatural stillness fell over the cemetery. Even the owl had stopped hooting. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Something wasn't right. I was about to call out to the others when I heard it. A whisper. Faint at first, like someone calling my name from far away. "Sst, Jason." I froze. It wasn't Kyle's voice, and it wasn't coming from Jenna or Sarah's direction. The whisper sounded closer, much closer, as if it were right behind me. Slowly, I turned around, half expecting Kyle to jump out and scare me. But there was no one there. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and scanned the cemetery. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around the tombstones, but there was no sign of my friends. The whispers continued, though. More of them now, and they were getting louder. "Jason, come closer." I took a step back, my breath coming in short gasps. "Kyle? Sarah? This isn't funny," I shouted, but there was no response. Suddenly, I saw movement in the fog, shadowy figures shifting between the tombstones. My pulse quickened as I realized these weren't my friends. These figures were taller, darker, and moved in ways that were anything but human. I ran. I didn't care about the prank anymore. I just wanted to get out of that cemetery. But no matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed me, growing louder and more insistent. The fog swirled around my feet, making it difficult to see the ground beneath me, and I stumbled, crashing into an old grave. I caught myself before falling into the open hole in front of me, an open grave that hadn't been there before. My breath caught in my throat. The earth around the grave was freshly disturbed, as if someone or something had just dug it up. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, but the whispers were deafening now, like a chorus of voices all calling my name. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. A figure taller than any human, standing at the edge of the grave. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its eyes, two glowing orbs of pale light, were fixed on me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I don't know how I made it out of the cemetery, but the next thing I remember, I was running down the road, my legs burning and my lungs gasping for air. When I finally reached the edge of town, I collapsed, unable to go any further. That's when Kyle, Jenna, and Sarah found me. They were out of breath, their faces pale with fear. "We need to go," Kyle said, his voice shaking. "Now." We didn't talk as we made our way back to Kyle's house, but I could tell they had seen something too. We locked the doors, turned off the lights, and sat in silence for what felt like hours. Finally, Kyle spoke. "The graves," he whispered. "They weren't empty. I didn't want to ask, but I had to know." "What did you see?" Kyle's eyes were wide with terror. "Figures, walking through the cemetery, but they weren't alive." Jenna and Sarah nodded, their faces ashen. "We saw them too," Jenna said softly. "They were coming out of the graves." I shuddered, the memory of those glowing eyes still fresh in my mind. The next day, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was the fog playing tricks on us, or maybe someone had set up the whole thing to scare us. But deep down, we knew the truth. We had disturbed something in that cemetery, something that had been resting for a long time, and now it was awake. For weeks after that night, the four of us were plagued by nightmares. Visions of graves opening, shadowy figures walking among the tombstones, and those same whispers calling our names. We avoided each other, too scared to talk about what we had seen. One by one, we all started to hear the knocking. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd hear a soft, rhythmic tapping at my window. 3 knocks. Always 3 knocks. I never opened the window, and I never went back to the cemetery. It was Halloween afternoon, and I still didn't have a costume. My friends had all planned theirs weeks ago, but I'd procrastinated as usual. With only a few hours left before the party, I found myself wandering aimlessly through town, hoping to stumble upon something interesting. That's when I saw it. A small, rundown shop tucked away in an alley. I'd never noticed it before, but the sign above the door read, "McCarthy's Masks" in faded letters. The place looked like it hadn't been open in years, but the door was slightly ajar, and curiosity got the best of me. I stepped inside, the smell of dust and old leather filling the air. The shop was dimly lit, and masks of all kinds lined the walls. Some made of porcelain, others of wood, and a few that looked disturbingly lifelike. Behind the counter stood an old man, hunched over, his wrinkled hands adjusting one of the masks on display. "Looking for something special?" he asked without looking up, his voice raspy and unsettling. "Yeah," I replied, trying to shake off the eerie vibe of the place. "I need a Halloween costume. Something scary." The old man finally looked at me, his pale blue eyes gleaming in the low light. He nodded slowly and motioned for me to follow him to the back of the shop. That's where I saw it. The mask. It was unlike any other mask in the shop. It looked like a face, but not a normal one. It was grotesque, with twisted features, hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, and a wide, cracked grin that stretched too far. The texture was strange too, almost like real skin. "This one," the old man said softly, "is perfect for you." I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to it. There was something about the mask that seemed to whisper to me, urging me to take it. Without thinking, I agreed, and the old man handed it over with a slow, deliberate smile. Later that night, I arrived at the Halloween party wearing my new mask. The moment I put it on, it felt strange, almost like it was molding to my face, fitting perfectly, too perfectly. But I brushed it off as a sign of a good costume. My friends were impressed, commenting on how creepy and lifelike it looked. "You really went all out this year," Sarah said, raising her drink in approval. "Where'd you get that thing?" Jake asked. "It's freaky as hell." I shrugged, not wanting to admit that I found it in some creepy old shop that I couldn't even remember the location of now. As the night went on, I started to feel weird. My skin tingled beneath the mask, and every time I looked in a mirror, I could swear the expression on the mask had changed, the grin widening ever so slightly. "Dude, are you okay?" Jake asked, noticing that I hadn't said much. "I'm fine," I lied, but something wasn't right. I could feel the mask tightening, like it was fusing with my skin. I tried to take it off, but it wouldn't budge. My heart started to race, panic creeping in. I rushed to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. Staring into the mirror, I tugged at the mask, but it wouldn't move. It felt like it was part of me now, like the mask and my face had become one. My breathing grew heavy, and I clawed at the edges, desperate to peel it off. But the mask only seemed to grip tighter. And that's when I heard it. Laughter. Faint, but distinct. It was coming from the mask itself, a low, sinister chuckle that sent a chill down my spine. The laughter grew louder, echoing in my head. I could feel the mask shifting on my face, like it was alive, like it had a mind of its own. My reflection in the mirror changed. The hollow eyes of the mask seemed to glow, and the twisted grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, until it looked more like a sneer. "What the hell is happening?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The mask answered with another laugh, and then, to my horror, my lips started moving on their own, stretching into that same grotesque grin. I wasn't in control anymore. My hands, my body, it all felt distant, like I was watching from the outside. I stumbled out of the bathroom, trying to get help, but when my friends saw me, they screamed. I tried to tell them it was me, that I needed help, but all that came out was a distorted, raspy voice that didn't sound like mine at all. "Get away from us!" Sarah shrieked, backing away. "Call 911. Jake shouted. But before they could do anything, I felt my legs moving on their own. I rushed toward them, my hands grabbing at Jake's arm. He screamed in pain as my fingers dug into his skin with inhuman strength. I wanted to stop, but I couldn't control my body anymore. The mask was in control. I don't remember much after that. It was like I was trapped in my own mind, watching as the mask used my body to terrorize my friends. The laughter in my head grew louder, more manic, as I lunged at Sarah and the others, chasing them through the house. I could hear their screams, feel the terror in their eyes, but I couldn't stop. My body moved with a will of its own, the mask's twisted grin never faltering. At some point, the police arrived. I remember flashing lights, the sound of sirens, and the shouts of officers. They tried to stop me, but the mask wouldn't let them. It made me attack, lunging at the officers with wild, unnatural speed. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I collapsed to the floor, the mask finally loosening its grip. I could feel my face again, my own thoughts returning. The mask fell off with a sickening slurp, landing on the ground with a thud. When I looked up, I saw the horror in everyone's eyes. My friends were huddled in the corner, terrified, and the police officers stood with their guns drawn, staring at me like I was a monster. But it wasn't me. It was the mask. They took me to the hospital, but no one could explain what had happened. The doctors said I had no injuries, no signs of trauma, but they couldn't explain why I'd gone berserk. My friends refused to speak to me after that night, and the police didn't press charges, though I could tell they wanted to. I went back to the mask shop the next day, but it was gone. The alley was empty, no sign that McCarthy's masks had ever existed. I asked around town, but no one had ever heard of the place. Now, every Halloween, I think about that night. I can still feel the weight of the mask, the way it gripped my face, the way it controlled me. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that same faint laughter echoing in the back of my mind. I never found out what the mask really was or where it came from. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never wear another mask again. Halloween had always been my favorite time of the year. The spooky decorations, the chilly autumn air, the thrill of dressing up and pulling pranks, it all made me feel alive. This year, my friends and I decided to take things up a notch. We were planning the ultimate scare, a clown prank. Everyone in our small town was already on edge thanks to the creepy clown sightings that had been happening in the area for the past few weeks. It was all over the news, people reporting strange clowns lurking in backyards, appearing at night, standing silently in windows. Most believed it was just a hoax, a group of kids trying to scare the neighborhood. So we decided to join in on the fun and give our friends the fright of their lives. Let's set up at the old Miller house, Dave suggested. It's abandoned, and no one will suspect a thing. The Miller house had been vacant for years. No one dared go near it because of the rumors that the place was haunted. It was the perfect setting for our prank. I agreed without hesitation. It would be easy. We'd sneak in, dress up as clowns, and scare a few kids or whoever wandered by. But I had no idea how wrong it would go. The night of Halloween, we gathered at Dave's house to prepare. There were 4 of us: Dave, Mark, Lisa, and me. We had everything planned out perfectly. We dressed in clown costumes, complete with oversized shoes, rainbow wigs, and those creepy painted smiles. Mark had even brought some fake blood to make it look more real. The plan was simple. Lisa and I would hide upstairs in the Miller house, while Dave and Mark would scare anyone passing by from the front porch. We'd shine a flashlight through the window upstairs, making it look like someone was inside, watching. Harmless fun, right? The moment we stepped into the old Miller house, though, I felt uneasy. The air inside was thick, heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on me. The wooden floors creaked under our feet as we moved through the dark, empty rooms. The wallpaper was peeling, and the faint smell of mold hung in the air. "Creepy as hell," Lisa whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. "Perfect for our prank," I grinned, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. We made our way upstairs and found the perfect room. The window faced the street, and anyone walking by would see our clown figures framed in the moonlight. Lisa and I settled in, hiding just out of sight, while Dave and Mark went outside to get ready. We waited in silence for what felt like hours, the sound of our breathing loud in the empty house. Finally, we saw a group of kids walking down the street, laughing and talking, their trick-or-treat bags swinging by their sides. I gave Lisa a nudge, and she flipped on the flashlight, shining it through the window. The beam of light landed on the kids, and they froze, staring up at the house. I could see them pointing at us, whispering to each other. "That's our cue," I whispered to Lisa. We slowly stepped into the light, our clown faces visible through the dirty glass. The kids screamed, their high-pitched voices piercing the night, and took off running down the street. Lisa and I burst into laughter, the adrenaline of the scare making my heart race. "That was too easy," Lisa said between laughs. We stayed in the room for a while, waiting for our next victim. But after about 20 minutes, we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from downstairs. I frowned, thinking it was Mark or Dave coming to check on us. But when I listened closer, the footsteps didn't sound like they were outside. They were inside the house. My heart skipped a beat. "Do you think someone's in here?" Lisa asked, her voice tense. "Maybe it's Mark or Dave messing with us," I said, though I didn't believe it. We peered out of the room, but the hallway was empty. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing up the stairs. My pulse quickened as I realized the steps were slow and heavy, too heavy to be one of my friends. "Dave? Mark?" I called, but no answer came. Lisa grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Jake, what if it's someone else?" I didn't want to admit it, but my stomach was twisting with dread. Whoever was walking up those stairs wasn't one of us. My hand shook as I reached for my phone, but just as I was about to text Dave, the footsteps stopped. Lisa and I stared at each other, barely breathing, waiting for what came next. Suddenly, we heard a voice, a soft, low chuckle, like someone laughing under their breath. It came from just outside the room. Lisa clutched my arm tighter, her nails digging into my skin. I swallowed hard. "We need to get out of here." But before we could move, the door to the room creaked open, and in the faint moonlight, we saw him, a clown. But not Mark or Dave. This clown was taller, his face painted in bright red and white, with a wide, maniacal grin that stretched too far. His eyes were black pits, and his clothes were ragged, stained with something dark. He just stood there, staring at us, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. I felt my blood turn to ice. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The clown didn't answer. He just tilted his head and smiled wider, that horrible grin spreading across his face. We didn't wait to find out what he wanted. Grabbing Lisa's hand, I bolted for the door. We tore down the stairs, our footsteps pounding against the creaky wood. The clown didn't chase us, but I could feel his eyes on our backs as we ran. Outside, we found Dave and Mark standing on the porch, looking confused. "What's going on?" Mark asked. "We thought you were still upstairs." "There's someone in the house?" I gasped, pulling Lisa with me as we sprinted toward the street. "A clown." Dave's face paled. "What? That's not funny, man." "We're not joking," Lisa snapped, tears in her eyes. "There's someone up there." Without another word, we ran down the street, our hearts pounding, the sound of that low, eerie chuckle still ringing in our ears. We didn't stop running until we were far from the house, far from the nightmare that had nearly caught us. The next morning, we drove by the Miller house to see if anyone had broken in after us. But the house was empty, just as it had always been. No sign of anyone, no footprints, no clowns. We never spoke of the prank again. But every Halloween, I think about the clown in the window, watching, waiting, and I wonder if he's still there, waiting for his next victims. Halloween had always been my favorite holiday. Every year, I went all out with decorations, parties, and the perfect costume. This year, though, I wanted something different, something that would blow everyone away. I was tired of the same old vampires, witches, and zombies. I wanted something unique, something no one else had ever seen. I spent weeks searching online for ideas, scrolling through every possible costume website and store, but nothing stood out. Then, 3 days before Halloween, I came across an ad on a random forum. It wasn't a typical Halloween costume site, it looked more like a private collection. The ad was simple: authentic, one-of-a-kind costumes for sale. Transform into something beyond imagination. Intrigued, I clicked the link. The website was bare bones, no flashy graphics or descriptions, just a few photos of costumes that looked disturbingly real. One costume, in particular, caught my eye. It was labeled The Forgotten Soul, and it looked like a mix between an old Victorian ghost and a demonic entity. The mask alone sent shivers down my spine. It was pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth stitched shut. It looked ancient, like something you'd find in a cursed tomb. Without thinking twice, I bought it. The site promised next-day delivery, which seemed too good to be true. But I figured it was just some high-end costume seller trying to stand out. I didn't know how right I was. The package arrived the next day, right on time. I opened the box with a mix of excitement and dread. Inside was the costume, neatly folded, and the mask, just as eerie as it had looked in the photos. But there was something else in the box. A handwritten note on yellowed paper. Wear it at your own risk. You may lose yourself to what's forgotten. I laughed it off as a cheesy marketing gimmick. After all, Halloween is all about scaring people, right? Still, something about the note made me feel uneasy. I shrugged it off and decided to try the costume on that night to see if it fit properly. When I slipped into the fabric, it felt heavier than I expected, like the weight of the past was clinging to me. The material was thick and cold against my skin, as though it hadn't been worn in years. Then I put on the mask. As soon as the mask covered my face, a wave of dizziness hit me. I stumbled back, catching myself on the edge of my bed. For a moment, everything went dark, like the world around me had blinked out of existence. Then, just as quickly, the sensation passed, and I was fine again. I laughed at myself, chalking it up to nerves. The costume looked incredible in the mirror, haunting, chilling, and disturbingly realistic. Perfect. The Halloween party that night was exactly what I had hoped for. My friends were in awe of the costume, especially the mask. Kyle, always the joker, tried to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the mask had fused to my face. I laughed it off, though I felt a flicker of unease. Looks like you're stuck with it, Sarah joked, snapping photos for Instagram. Throughout the night, people kept complimenting the costume, asking where I got it, but something strange happened as the night went on. Every time someone touched the fabric or tried to examine the mask more closely, they shivered, pulling their hands away like they had touched something cold and dead. Man, it feels like ice, Jenna said, rubbing her hand after brushing against the sleeve. I started to feel uneasy again, but I didn't want to spoil the night. It was Halloween after all, but as the clock approached midnight, I began to feel different. The mask, which had been snug but comfortable, now felt tight. Too tight. It was as if it was pressing into my skin, molding to my face. I tried to pull it off, but it didn't budge. Panic set in. I ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind me, and yanked at the mask again, harder this time. It still wouldn't come off. Then I looked in the mirror, and my blood turned to ice. The mask had changed. The once hollow eyes were now filled with dark, swirling shadows, and the stitched mouth seemed to twitch as if it were about to open. My reflection didn't look like me anymore. It looked like someone or something else. I screamed, but no sound came out. The mask's stitched mouth had taken hold of my own, sealing it shut. I clawed at it, but my fingers were numb, like I was losing control of my own body. That's when I noticed the note on the bathroom counter. The one that had come with the costume. It wasn't just lying there. It had changed. The words had shifted, rearranged themselves into something new. You wore what was forgotten. Now you'll be forgotten too. The mask felt like it was pulsing now, alive, feeding off my fear. My vision blurred, and the room spun around me. I could hear faint whispers, like a crowd of voices all speaking at once, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. Desperate, I ran back out to the party, waving my arms, trying to get someone's attention. But no one seemed to notice. They were all still talking, laughing, dancing, but it was like I didn't exist anymore. I grabbed Kyle's arm, but he pulled away, frowning. "Hey man, who are you?" he asked, looking genuinely confused. It was like he didn't recognize me. "Guys, where's Jason?" Sarah asked, looking around the room. "Wasn't he just here?" I tried to shout to tell them it was me, but the mask's grip tightened even more, choking off any sound. My friends were staring right at me, but it was as if they were seeing someone else entirely. I was being erased. By the end of the night, no one remembered me. Not Kyle, not Sarah, not Jenna. It was as if I had never existed. I ran out of the house into the cold night air, trying to tear the mask off once more. But it was too late. The whispers in my head grew louder, drowning out my own thoughts, filling my mind with memories that weren't mine. Memories of people long dead. I stumbled down the street, lost in the fog of forgotten souls. The world around me blurred. and I knew I was slipping away, fading into the background, becoming nothing more than another forgotten spirit. Now I wander the streets every Halloween, wearing the mask that has become my prison. No one sees me, no one remembers me, but I remember them. I always will. It all started as a Halloween dare. Our friend group, me, Kyle, Sarah, and Jenna, had always pushed limits with pranks, but this time Kyle wanted to raise the stakes. "There's a house on Maple Street," he said one night over pizza. "They say it's haunted. No one's lived there for years, but if you knock on the door at midnight, something happens." Kyle's grin made me uneasy, but Sarah and Jenna seemed intrigued. "What happens?" Jenna asked. "If you knock 3 times, the door opens and you'll see a figure inside. But you have to leave before the clock strikes 12:01, or you'll never make it out." We laughed, but Kyle's tone was serious. Sarah jumped on the idea. "We go there tonight?" A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't back out. At 11:30, we stood in front of the Thompson house, flashlights in hand. The place radiated neglect and decay. "This is insane," I muttered. Kyle brushed it off, and we followed him. The moon cast eerie shadows, and every step heightened my unease. Kyle led us to the front door, a massive, dark wooden structure. "Ready?" he asked, checking the time. I glanced at Sarah, who nodded, and Jenna, who looked pale but game. Kyle knocked 3 times. For a moment nothing happened, and I relaxed, until the door creaked open. Inside, the darkness felt wrong, thick and alive. The air was colder than outside, carrying a moldy scent. Kyle tried to downplay it, but then Jenna pointed. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, tall, motionless, cloaked in shadows. My heart skipped. "Let's go," I whispered. But Kyle moved closer, his flashlight aimed at it. The light seemed to vanish into the figure's shadows. "Seriously, Kyle, let's go," Sarah urged. Then Kyle's phone beeped. 12:01. The door slammed behind us, and the figure began to move, stepping closer. We bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was almost upon us, shifting and blurring as if not fully solid. The closer it got, the harder it was to breathe. Suddenly, the door flew open, and we tumbled out. We didn't stop running until we reached the street. When we looked back, the door was closed, the figure gone. We stood in silence, hearts racing. "We're never doing this again," I whispered. In the following days, we avoided each other and the street. But something had changed. Kyle was the first to notice. "I keep hearing knocking," he said. "At my window, my door. It won't stop." I'd heard it too, soft, steady knocks, and each night they grew louder. Then I began seeing the figure, in the shadows of my room, the streets, always watching, waiting. I don't know what we let out that night, but it followed us, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants. Halloween was always a big deal in our town, and every year the pranks got crazier. But this year, our friend group decided to outdo them all. It was supposed to be the ultimate scare, a haunted basement experience for the neighborhood. I wasn't a fan of haunted houses, but when Sam, our prank master, pitched the idea, we all agreed. The house belonged to his uncle, Mr. Greenwood, who'd moved away years ago, leaving it vacant. It had fallen into disrepair, peeling paint, broken windows, and a musty odor that crept out from the cracks. But what made the house truly unsettling was the basement. Rumor had it that Mr. Greenwood's wife had died down there in some freak accident. Whether or not that was true, the idea of using it for our Halloween prank gave us the chills. "I'll set up the props," Sam said excitedly. "We'll have fake skeletons, blood, the works. You guys just need to act scared." We all agreed. Nick, Amy, and I. The plan was simple. Lure unsuspecting trick-or-treaters into the house and give them the fright of their lives. What could go wrong? The night of Halloween, we gathered at the house, our breath fogging in the cold air. Sam had already rigged the place with his cheap horror props, plastic spiders, fake cobwebs, and speakers that blasted creepy sounds. But the basement was the centerpiece. That's where the real scare would happen. As we descended the stairs to set up, I noticed something off about the basement. It was damp and smelled like rotten wood, but there was something else. Something heavier in the air. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows on the walls that made my heart race. Creepy, huh? Nick grinned, but I could tell he was just as spooked. Sam was busy arranging fake body parts and splattering fake blood everywhere. But as he was moving an old dusty crate to make room for a prop, something unexpected happened. The floor underneath the crate creaked and then collapsed, revealing a dark, narrow hole. "What the hell is that?" Amy asked, stepping back. "I don't know," Sam replied, wiping the dust off his hands. "Looks like some kind of hidden tunnel." The hole was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. We peered inside, but all we could see was darkness. The air coming from it was colder, much colder than the rest of the basement. It sent a shiver down my spine. "Should we check it out?" Nick asked, half joking. "No way," I replied quickly. "This place is creepy enough." But Sam, always the thrill seeker, was already on his knees, shining his flashlight into the hole. "I bet this'll make the prank even better," he said. "Imagine leading people down here, into this creepy tunnel." He crawled into the hole before any of us could stop him. We waited for Sam to come back, but after a few minutes, we started to get nervous. The air in the basement seemed to grow thicker, colder. The speakers Sam had set up continued to play their eerie soundtrack, but now it sounded like a distant echo, like something real was blending in with the fake. "Sam, you okay?" Amy called out, her voice shaky. There was no answer. I swallowed hard and looked at Nick. Maybe we should go in after him. "Are you crazy?" Nick shook his head, but he didn't move. Amy was already pacing, her eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, we heard a low moaning sound. It wasn't coming from the speakers, it was coming from the tunnel. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, trying to peer into the hole. That's when I saw it. A hand. But it wasn't Sam's hand. It was pale, with long bony fingers and dirt-stained nails. It reached up from the darkness, grasping at the edge of the tunnel like something was pulling itself up. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Amy's arm. We bolted up the stairs, Nick right behind us. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath. The house loomed over us, its windows dark, its silence unnerving. "What was that?" Amy cried, tears streaming down her face. "That wasn't Sam." "We need to get him out of there," I said, though my legs were shaking. Whatever we had just seen, it wasn't human. We waited outside for what felt like hours, trying to decide what to do. None of us wanted to go back inside, but we couldn't leave Sam. Just as we were about to call the police, the basement door creaked open. Sam emerged, looking pale, his clothes dirty, his eyes wide with fear. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, a figure stood in the doorway. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. Its bony hand rested on Sam's shoulder, as if guiding him out of the house. "Sam?" Nick called, his voice shaking. Sam didn't respond. He just kept walking toward us, his eyes blank, his face expressionless. The figure followed him, its form growing more distinct in the dim light. Its face was twisted, its eyes black, its mouth stretching into a wide, unnatural grin. Amy screamed, and we all backed away, frozen in place. Sam stopped a few feet from us. "We shouldn't have disturbed it," he whispered. His voice was hollow, distant. "Now it's awake." The figure behind him stepped forward, its grin widening, and the temperature around us plummeted. I could feel its gaze on us, cold and malevolent. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, without warning, Sam collapsed, and the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows of the house. We rushed to Sam, shaking him awake. His eyes fluttered open, but he didn't seem to recognize us at first. "What happened?" he mumbled, confused. "Where am I?" We didn't have answers. All we knew was that something unnatural had been lurking in that basement, something we had disturbed. We never went back to the house, and we never spoke of the prank again. Sam eventually recovered, but he didn't remember much of that night. And the hole in the basement? It was gone, sealed up as if it had never existed. But I know what I saw. We all did. Every Halloween since then, I hear the faint sound of footsteps coming from the basement, the soft creak of the floorboards, and I remember the thing that crawled out of the darkness that night. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a joke. It was real. Halloween had always been about harmless fun. At least, that's what we told ourselves. Every year, my friends and I would pull pranks, scare each other, and visit the town's so-called haunted spots. But this year, Trevor, always the one to push things too far, came up with a new challenge: spend the night in the old Donovan house. The Donovan house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. The story went that Mr. Donovan had murdered his wife and children before hanging himself in the attic, and the house had stood empty ever since. Of course, no one really believed the stories. It was the town's favorite urban legend, and we all knew it was just a bunch of made-up ghost tales meant to scare kids. Or so I thought. "I dare you to stay there till sunrise," Trevor said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Easy," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my heart beat a little faster at the thought. The house was creepy, sure, but it was just a house, a broken-down, creaky, and neglected place, but still just wood and nails. "I'll come too," said Katie, always the brave one. Before I could object, Trevor and another friend, Ryan, volunteered as well. It was settled. We'd meet up at the house just before midnight and spend the night there, proving once and for all that the Donovan house was nothing more than a decaying building. Or so we thought. When we arrived at the house, the wind had picked up, sending leaves skittering across the ground like whispers of things unseen. The Donovan house loomed before us, its windows dark, its paint peeling, and its door hanging slightly ajar. I could already feel the oppressive atmosphere of the place. My stomach churned, but I shook it off. This was just another Halloween prank, right? "Let's go," Trevor said, his voice barely containing his excitement. We stepped inside, flashlights cutting through the dusty air. The interior was worse than I expected. The floor creaked with every step, and cobwebs hung thick from the ceiling. The air was stale, and the silence in the house felt heavy, like the place was waiting for something. "Let's check out the rooms," Katie suggested. She moved ahead, her flashlight, revealing the faded floral wallpaper of the living room. Old furniture lay scattered, some pieces overturned, others rotting in place. We made our way through the house, laughing nervously, jumping at shadows, but deep down, we all knew it was just an act. At least, that's what we thought until we reached the attic. The attic was where Mr. Donovan was said to have hung himself. Of course, it was just a story, but standing there at the base of the narrow staircase leading up, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of fear. "Come on, let's get this over with," Ryan said, already halfway up the stairs. I followed, Trevor and Katie behind me. The attic door creaked open as Ryan pushed it, revealing a dark, musty space filled with old trunks and dusty boxes. The air up there was colder, and I shivered, even though the night was mild. We spread out, checking out the old belongings that had been left behind. I found an old mirror, its glass so fogged that my reflection was nothing more than a blurred outline. Trevor was messing with an old trunk when Katie suddenly froze. "Do you guys hear that?" she whispered. We all stopped. At first, I didn't hear anything, just the faint whistle of the wind outside. But then I caught it, a soft creaking sound like someone slowly rocking in a chair. We shone our flashlights around, but there was nothing, just old furniture and dust. But the sound persisted, growing louder, more distinct. "Let's get out of here," Ryan muttered, heading for the stairs. But as he turned, the attic door slammed shut, sending a loud bang echoing through the space. We all jumped, hearts pounding, and Ryan rushed to the door. It wouldn't budge. "It's stuck," he yelled, pulling at the handle. Trevor and I tried to help, but no matter how hard we pushed, the door wouldn't open. The creaking sound was growing louder now, coming from right behind us. I turned, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I saw it, an old rocking chair in the far corner of the attic, slowly moving back and forth as though someone invisible was sitting there. Panic surged through me. "Who's there?" Trevor called out, his voice shaking. There was no answer, only the rhythmic creak of the chair. Katie was backing away, her face pale. "This isn't funny, guys," she said, her voice trembling. "Who's doing this?" "No one," I said, my mouth dry. "No one's doing this." The temperature in the attic seemed to drop even more. My breath came out in visible puffs as a sudden, oppressive cold settled over the room. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt something. Not someone, something. A presence, heavy, dark, watching us. I heard a whisper then, faint but unmistakable. It was a low voice, murmuring words I couldn't understand. The rocking chair creaked faster now, as if the unseen occupant was agitated, restless. Trevor was banging on the door now, panic in his eyes. "Let us out!" he screamed. And then, as suddenly as it had slammed shut, the door flew open. We stumbled out, racing down the stairs, but the feeling of being watched followed us through the house. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for breath. Once we were safely out of the house, the cold air hit me, but I was still shivering. "What the hell just happened?" Ryan asked, his face pale, his hands trembling. "I don't know," I said, struggling to catch my breath. But it wasn't a prank. Katie was shaking her head, eyes wide with terror. "I felt something in there, Jake. Something was watching us." None of us said anything for a long time. We stood there, staring at the dark silhouette of the Donovan house, trying to process what had just happened. The rocking chair, the whispers, the door slamming. It wasn't part of our prank. It wasn't a trick. The next day, I looked up the history of the Donovan house, and my blood ran cold. Mr. Donovan hadn't just killed his family. According to the old newspapers, he had spent months building an elaborate trap in the attic, convinced that his wife and children were possessed. He believed that by killing them, he would free their spirits from the curse that haunted them. I don't know if I believe in curses or haunted houses, but what I do know is that something in that house wanted us gone. And it wasn't a Halloween trick. It was real.